Welcome to the Mackie Movies Recap. I want to show you a great film titled 12 Years a Slave. Please watch it till the end. This film is based on a true story. In the first scene of the film, a group of slaves are being taught how to cut sugarcane. A man lazily observes the work of the men while perched atop a wagon filled with raw cane root. The setting changes to a collection of shacks. Slaves are currently eating. Solomon Northup is motivated to develop ink into quill after observing the dark juice of blackberries. Unfortunately, the plan doesn't work. Juice is far too thin. Later, a woman stirs in her sleep in the cramped slave quarters and makes a sexual advance at Northup, using his hand as leverage. The title card flashes as Solomon remembers happier days spent with his wife and kids. Snapshots of Solomon's life as a free man are shown. In his hometown of Saratoga, he is in high demand as a violinist due to his superb playing. Later that evening, after putting the kids to bed, he has a conversation with his wife, who will soon take the kids with her to her job as a cook. He jealously complains about not getting her cooking. He sends them off in a carriage the next morning. Later that day, he runs across a friend who introduces him to two tourists, Brown and Hamilton, who say they work for a performance that resembles a circus. They guarantee his return before his wife returns, and offer him an extravagant sum in exchange for traveling with them to Washington, D.C. He consents to follow them. The group is next seen dining in a D.C. restaurant. His customers give him a bag of coins that is larger than the amount they had promised. They both drink wine, and one of them keeps a tight eye on Solomon while he finishes his. The good times are being had by all. Solomon awakens abruptly while shackled to the floor of a dingy jail. His friends bring him to his hotel room in a succession of flashbacks, explaining his inebriated state to other guests. Hamilton is urged by Brown to finish the task at hand because time is running out. The flashback comes to an end with their departure, and we pick up with Solomon in his cell after learning that he is a runaway slave from Georgia. He claims to be a free man, yet he lacks any identification. Solomon is brutally beaten before being placed with other slaves in a pen. He talks about his predicament with Clemens, a slave who appears to be educated, and Clemens gives him advice about how serious their predicament is. Eliza, a mother, and her daughter are soon brought to the enclosure to join a captured son. While realizing the impending disaster, she makes an effort to maintain her bravery. They are taken from their cell in the shadows, chained, and put on a riverboat. They are led to the cargo hold, which is overflowing with other people. Clemens reiterates his recommendation that Solomon keep a low profile and deny his literacy. They come into Robert, another slave who wants to seize control of the ship and mutiny. They weigh their chances before choosing to be cautious. Later that evening, a slaver comes to the hold and wakes Eliza, so that she can be raped. Robert is stabbed to death while trying to halt the rape. When Clemens and Solomon are accused of throwing the body into the river, he says that Robert is better off dead. They eventually reach a dock. When they arrive, Clemens' master is waiting for them and demands the restitution of his stolen goods. Clemens abandons all traces of his previously demonstrated intelligence as he scrambles down into his master's embrace in gratitude. Solomon's one and only friend is gone. A slaver, ironically named Freeman, calls his new property to their feet after disembarking by calling their names. He refers to Solomon as Platt, which is a name he definitely doesn't know. Solomon receives a blow for rejecting the name. The naked slaves bathe in buckets in Freeman's headquarters, displaying the ugliness of his slave system. He performs his sales pitch to interested clients inside. Platt, Solomon, and Eliza are the subject of curiosity from a polite plantation owner, Ford. Although she begs him to take her kids too, Freeman refuses and quickly sells her son to another buyer. Ford tries to purchase her daughter, who is obviously of mixed ancestry, but Freeman once more won't lower his price. Only the two can be paid for by Ford. Eliza is upset, and shouts hysterically in her anguish, disrupting the sale. To lighten the mood, Solomon is told to play the fiddle. Ford returns his purchases to his plantation by truck. Eliza has been crying the entire journey. Food and a good night's sleep, according to Ford's wife, will help her forget them. The slaves are introduced to Ford's overseer, Chapin, and a slave handler named Tibius the next morning. While the slaves are working, Tibius mockingly sings a song urging them not to escape. They keep on cutting wood until they come upon a small group of indigenous people, with whom they have a brief break. As soon as Solomon sees a stringed instrument, he seems to recall his own violin. The following day, Solomon approaches Ford with a creative plan to ship the logs by river, despite Clemens's advice. Although Tibius is incredibly patronizing, Ford is won over by Solomon's viewpoints and is persuaded. Tibius is humiliated after the plan is successful. Ford rewards Solomon with a violin to play. Eliza is lamenting the loss of her children back at the slave quarters. Solomon debates with her about enduring Ford's good treatment after becoming irritated by the noise. Ford must undoubtedly be aware that Solomon is not a slave, but Eliza counters that Ford does nothing to free him. It causes Solomon to hesitate. Ford's wife eventually sells Eliza because she can't stand the noise. Over the following few days, Tibius tries to exact small-scale retaliation against Solomon, which results in an argument. Tibius makes an effort to defeat Solomon, but Solomon fights back and prevails. Tibius is forced to flee when Chapin enters the scene. He cautions him that if he flees, he cannot protect him, and makes it seem as though he would have Ford fix it. Later, we learn that Tibius has assembled thugs to lynch Solomon for having the audacity to challenge him. When Chapin returns with his weapons drawn, they have the rope around his neck and are getting ready to hang him. He chases them away, but permits Solomon to stand there on tiptoes, hardly able to maintain himself, punishment for striking a white man. Slaves gradually emerge from their huts, but they don't seem to care about his situation. Water is covertly brought to him by a woman, who then immediately leaves. After what seems like hours, Ford returns and cuts the rope to free Solomon. For protection, he drags him inside the house, but ultimately decides that he must be sold. Tibius won't relinquish his right to retaliation. In this passage, we discover that Ford had sold Solomon to Epps, a renowned plantation owner with a history of brutal beatings. Epps reads a verse from the Bible, while skewing the text, to support his claim to ownership of the slaves. The day of cotton picking is the next day. The weight of each worker's bundles is noted at the end of the day. The yield of Solomon is below average. Slaves who made fewer selections than the previous day are lashed. While Patsy produces nearly twice as much as the greatest worker, Patsy is circled by Epps as he lavishes praise on her. He clearly finds her fascinating, which makes his wife unhappy. When Epps enters the slave quarters and wakes them up, an impromptu dance is performed with Patsy at the center. Epps' wife physically scars Patsy by hurling a large crystal decanter at her face. She insists that Epps sell Patsy, but he refuses, saying that he would rather lose Patsy than his wife. Solomon is given a task by Mistress Epps to go to the store. She gives him a list and observes him looking through it. She is adamant that he not repeat the behavior. Solomon is motivated to make an escape attempt while walking to the store, but accidentally walks into a lynching. His morale is crushed upon learning the two men's fate, yet he nevertheless makes his way to the store. When he sees the paper, he gets the idea to bring a spare sheet with him every time, so he can write a note. Later, Epps sends Solomon to a Shaw plantation in the area. Shaw raised the status of one of his slaves by marrying her, at least on his plantation. Patsy is visiting and taking in the finery, but it seems that Epps is envious that Shaw could try to seduce her. After a little period of relaxation, Solomon persuades Patsy to follow him. They get back to Epps' plantation, and he's obviously inebriated. Patsy hears Solomon urging her to stay away from Epps in a whisper, which Epps misinterprets as a sexual arousal. Mrs. Shaw steps in after a wild pursuit around the yard, if only to voice her disapproval at her husband's fixation on Patsy. Epps wanders to the slave quarters later that evening and rapes her. Mrs. Shaw reprimands Patsy for her husband's adultery before brutally slicing her face. Later that evening, Patsy begs Solomon to kill her by hanging her and burying her body. She is unable to continue bearing the weight of Epps' rapes and his wife's suffering. She begs Solomon to accept, but he refuses. Later, we observe that insects had completely destroyed the cotton plantations at Epps. He chooses to lend his slaves to a judge so that he can utilize them and use the proceeds to pay the mortgage on their purchases after 2 crops fail. This brings us back to Solomon cutting sugarcane in the opening scene. Because of Solomon's talent, the judge suggests him to a neighbor looking for music for a party. The justices also rule that Solomon is allowed to keep his earnings. Solomon can readily draw comparisons between his forced servitude and his former existence as a free man at a fancy costume ball. It's time to head back to Epps' farm now that the celebration has ended. Patsy's bloodied eye suggests that her tortures have continued as Solomon approaches the house. Back to the fields now that the cotton crop has been harvested. This time, a white laborer named Armsby joins them. He is picking to make money, so he can get back on his feet. Despite producing significantly less than any other worker, he is exempt from the lashing that all other slaves must endure. He attends to Solomon's wounds and shares his tale in the quarters. He seems like a good man with a sympathetic ear. In an effort to win his freedom, Solomon decides to take a chance by entrusting him with mailing a letter to the north. He hands Armsby all of the party proceeds and swears him to silence. In 2 days, he will deliver the letter to him. After making ink, Solomon begins to write the letter. Just that evening, Epps walks Solomon outdoors after entering the quarters. Armsby breached his promise and revealed all to Epps. Thankfully, he narrated his tale prior to Solomon handing him the letter. Thinking swiftly and capitalizing on Epps' disdain for slaves, he turns the narrative around and accuses Armsby of lying and trying to gain favor in order to secure a job. Solomon is spared after Epps is convinced by this tale. Later, after burning the letter, Solomon sees his chances for freedom vanish in the ashes. A while later, Base, a hired laborer, is working with a group of construction workers to build a structure. Base comes from the north and has strong anti-slavery beliefs, which contrast with Epps' staunch pro-slavery views. The chit-chat going on in front of Solomon caught his attention. Later, Epps gets all worked up over Patsy. Epps believes she has fled away because she has vanished. She has only returned to Shaw's plantation to see her buddy, despite his threats to harm all the ladies because of her loss. She makes an effort to persuade Epps that she is loyal to him and that she went there to purchase some soap, a luxury that Epps' wife has refused her. She insists loudly that she is worth it and that she has a right to be clean. When his wife starts arguing, Epps loses it and demands that she be bound to the whipping post. He is about to strike when he realizes he cannot deliver the punishment. He gruesomely demands Solomon do it. Solomon makes an initial effort to be soft, but Mr. Seps detects the trick and encourages her husband to become more severe. If Patsy is not whipped more severely, Epps threatens to shoot any slave he sees and holds a gun to Solomon's head. When faced with an unfathomable decision, he whips her harder, a pink mist of blood flowing with each blow. She then pauses. In a fit of anger, Epps charges forward and ultimately whips Patsy. Her flesh is torn to pieces by the horrific punishment, and she falls. Solomon is left alone with the hired help, Base. When Base replies, Canada, Solomon demonstrates his convincing familiarity with the nation. Solomon then asks Base where he's from. Solomon reveals his precarious situation to Base, when asked how he has gone so widely. Base begins to accept Solomon's account, and recognizes the terrible injustice involved. Solomon takes a chance, and asks Base to send letters to his pals in Saratoga as they continue to labor. Base concurs. Once the job is done, he departs. Solomon remains a long shot. He doesn't know if Base has maintained his promise. Although we don't know how long Base has been gone, the tears in Solomon's eyes suggest that he may be starting to believe that he has once again been misled. Men are now seen tilling the ground and sowing seedlings. When a carriage arrives at the Epps plantation, a man in a suit calls out for Platt, Solomon. He responds and moves toward the man, a sheriff. The man motions to another man in the train, while asking him a few questions. It is Solomon's buddy Mr. Parker, a store owner from Saratoga. The sheriff quickly comes around to Solomon's point of view, and runs to give him a bear hug. Epps yells empty threats, while he is furious. Parker assists Solomon in boarding the carriage that will transport him to safety, while the sheriff responds to the protests. Patsy, who is present, calls to him. To give her one final embrace before leaving, Solomon leaps from the carriage. He walks away, and Patsy collapses in tears. Solomon has now been brought inside. He is filled with emotion as he stands outside his door after being rescued from his nightmare. He sees his family as soon as he walks in. Despite being 12 years older, they were shocked to see him. The son of his daughter and her husband is known as Solomon Northup. They surround him and welcome him home as tears stream down their faces. He tried to sue his kidnappers but was unsuccessful, as is stated in a series of title cards. Northup developed as an abolitionist who helped several fugitives gain freedom. Please subscribe, like, and comment below for appreciation. That would be a great help.